It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman. You can find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting. Just shoot me an email over at Opperman Investigations. And our guest today, Matt Sergiou. Sometimes we used to call him Matt Conspiro, but it's Matt Sergiou. You could find our previous interviews we did there with him. As a matter of fact, today's a part two of his Bloomsbury group that we did an interview with. Just fascinating material he gave us last week. You could find him at conspiromedia.wordpress.com, occultbeatles.wordpress.com. On Facebook, you can find him at Conspiro Media, and all the links are there, including his excellent YouTube channel, Conspiro TV. Mr. Matt Sergiou, are you there?
I'm here. I'm blushing with utter joy at your beautiful intro there. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I barely touched you, man. I barely did you justice there.
Oh, shucks.
Great stuff. And I enjoyed our talk last time so much. I really did. You put me in a good mood.
Yeah.
Remind me, real quick. Give us a recap of what we talked about with the Bloomsbury group.
Okay, so this now is a continuation of a summarized version of a video on my YouTube page, as you say, Conspiro TV. It's about the Bloomsbury group, as you say, this group of, in the main, they were artists, art critics, writers and novelists who have been dubbed. The reason that they're called the Bloomsbury group is because initially they used to meet and talk and socialise and go about their artistic temperaments at an address in Bloomsbury, which is a district in West London. And this was in the early 20th century. As I mentioned previously in the previous episodes, the Bloomsbury group have been they've been regarded by a number of historians and commentators who've looked into them as a precursor, if you like, of the free-loving, sexually permissive 1960s, given that the Bloomsbury group were, within their own group, within their own kind of, they were a version of that. In other words, you might say they were ahead of their time. They were sexually permissive within their own group. They were free thinkers, as I say. They also rebelled against the strict moral codes of their Victorian English upbringing as well. They were regarded as bohemian in their lifestyle choices and values. So fast forward to the 1960s, and you might not be blamed for seeing parallels there. If you look at the 60s, what with the rise of the teenager, the younger generation at that time rebelling against their own the previous generation against their parents' generation, their parents' beliefs and lifestyle choices. The 1960s was about pushing a new cultural identity, so we're told. I don't know. I didn't live through it. I can only go by what people have said to me and what I've read and seen in documentaries and so on. So the 60s, we're told, was about free love, sexual permissiveness. Certainly that's what was being pushed in the 60s. And, of course, it also saw the legalisation in England in 1967 of homosexuality. And homosexuality in the beginning years of the 20th century in England was championed and practised by the Bloomsbury groupers. So in my YouTube video, you can see me going on a street tour of Bloomsbury in London. I did this back in early 2023. I went for a little break to London, a city break, and filmed some of the locations there in London on my phone, and collated that all together and put together this video on YouTube. So and what I've done in the video is I've tried to point out comparisons between the Bloomsbury group and the 1960s counterculture in London to see if there's any similarities or parallels between what Dave McGowan discussed with regards to his work on the Laurel Canyon scene, and to see whether there were any parallels there with the British so-called counterculture scene of the 1960s, to see if it was a socially engineered psyop, the same as what Dave McGowan suggested in his research. So we left off in the last episode looking at the British writer and philosopher Bertrand Russell, who was a friend of the Bloomsbury group. He wasn't a part of it, but he was certainly within the peripheries of it, and he did socialise with them. And he also lived in Bloomsbury. He had an apartment there. And he was also a major founding father of the CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, in the late 1950s, I think it was. And he helped to bring together a cross-section of the British population through the membership of the CND. We got this. There was a cross-section, tens and tens and tens of thousands of members who joined this CND. And as I say, it was a cross-section of. It was a cross-generational divide of just about every person and every genre of the population you can think of, from grandmothers to grandfathers to the clergy to business people to you name it, and mixed in. Amongst all of that, you had the so-called bohemians and the beatniks, young people at that time who were living on the peripheries of the mainstream or chose to live an alternative lifestyle away from the mainstream of Britain at the time, and who were kind of anti-establishment, if you like. So all these people were mixing together.
Any musicians?
Not that I'm aware of off the top of my head. I would certainly say there was a lot of folkies involved, people who was into folk music, who were kind of because folk music at that time was very much anti-establishment, wasn't it? I mean, I think you can say the same in America as well, with Dylan and Joan Baez and Pete Seeger and all those guys and many, many others. So what people have said since, people who were around during the countercultural milieu, if you like, of 60s London, they've looked back at those days of the CND and said that it's thanks in large part to the CND and this. Yeah, it was what the CND helped to do. What Bertrand Russell's CND helped to do was to act as a catalyst for what would later become the 60s hippies in the later years, in the later part of the 1960s, because a lot of the people, these so-called beatniks and bohemians, who would not have known that each other, that there were others like them that existed in the UK, met when they went on these protest marches with the CND. They met and saw each other and realised, hey, look, oh, wow, there's actually somebody like me. So it was like a catalyst of like-minded youngsters who were rebelling against their parents' generation, meeting together. So, it was like a kind of a catalyst. And one of those who was inspired by the CND and who was one of those youngsters who later went on to become the de facto leader of the 60s counterculture scene of London, and who I mentioned in the last episode was John Hoppy Hopkins. And as I mentioned in the first episode, his background is Laurel Canyon-esque, if you like, because some years before becoming the de facto leader of the 60s underground scene of London, he was a nuclear physicist for the British government, and also approached by British intelligence services to work for them, apparently an offer that he refused, so we're told, but who knows what happened there.
And it's the fellow who became a photographer.
That's the fellow who,
right.
So 1 minute he's a nuclear physicist, then he decides to get away from that and become a cameraman, a photographer, and lo and behold, he finds himself working for some of the biggest newspapers and magazines of London within a couple of years, photographing the biggest names of the 1960s, like the Beatles, the Stones, Martin Luther King, Bertrand Russell, William Burroughs. And then within a year or two of that, he becomes this de facto stick-it-to-the-man leader of the British countercultural scene of London. So that is quite Laurel Canyon-esque.
Yeah, Burroughs is a fascinating character too, who wrote a book.
Oh, yeah.
He wrote a story at least about about everything else. But one thing that's little known is he wrote this story about the Mayan calendar and the world ending in 2012, way back then.
Okay. Oh, I didn't know that.
Where's that come from?
Wow.
Yeah, right.
And he.
Go ahead.
I was going to say he was very much in the mix. He was in the countercultural mix.
Oh, yeah.
Of London.
Well, the story is he's the one that taught the Beatles to do the backward masking, to do the reverse. And he wrote whole entire articles and poems and stuff like that in reverse. This guy was a reverse guy,
Yeah, I think he was also he specialised in, what was it called? Oh, it's gone now. Where you do cut-ups. That's it.
Right.
Cut-ups, where you take. I think what cut-ups is. He wasn't I don't think he invented it, as it were. I think it was somebody else, but he was certainly one of the kind of like the champions of it. You would look, basically, I think what cut-ups is you write a sentence or a paragraph, just words, and it all makes sense. It could be about anything.
Then you jumble it up.
You jumble it up, you cut it up with scissors, and then you throw it in the air and jumble it up, and then you see the order of how it. You see how however those cut-ups fall on the floor, those cut-up words. You look at the order that they come up in randomness, and you write song lyrics or whatever. But he did actually have a flat. There was a flat in London. It was actually a house in London. I can't remember where it was. I think it's near Piccadilly Circus. It's not that far away. It's about 2-3 minute walk from Piccadilly Circus. And I think it used to be Brian Epstein's house.
Really?
I think, I can't remember. What I do know is that Ringo Starr bought the lease, or he rented it, and he lived in it with his wife, I think Maureen, and then he gave the basement to Paul McCartney, who then turned it into his own studio, a private studio. And he never used it really. But what he did do was he allowed William Burroughs to go down there and use it to experiment in. And I think he was downstairs in that basement doing his cut-ups. Yeah.
Unfortunately, Burroughs was not quite the marksman.
Yeah.
That one. Yeah. Now, what was the disposition of that case? Because he did kill his wife. I suppose he's trying to shoot an apple off her head. But what was the disposition of that case? Do we know?
I don't know the exact details of that. It's not something I've really followed. But there's all sorts of weird stuff going on. There was Kerouac as well, wasn't it? Jack Kerouac and Ginsberg. There was a murder. Someone got murdered and they were implicated in it. Or am I going way off base?
I wasn't aware of that. But that's in my notes here. I was just about to ask you, because if you look at the Laurel Canyon bunch, or that hippie New York, Timothy Leary, and even Stephen Stills from Crosby, Stills and Nash, they all had open cases. They had open cases with the police. They were being prosecuted. The whole time Timothy Leary's his public life, he had an open marijuana case. Now, anything like that with these guys, because then usually that's an indication of a guy making a deal.
Yeah.
Any kind of an indication here with this group that they had kind of criminal cases going on, being charges or suspicious dropping charges?
Yeah. Somebody else who, aside from John Hoppy Hopkins, somebody else, back to to this CND thing, somebody else who was part of that CND movement back in the early. CND is still going now. It's nowhere near as big as it was then, I don't think. But somebody else who was part of that before he then went on to become one of the main movers and shakers of the 60s countercultural underground scene of London, alongside John Hoppy Hopkins, was a guy by the name of Peter Jenner. Again, Cambridge University educated, so he comes from this quote-unquote elite university where kings, queens, politicians, you name it, have gone to study over the years, over the decades. Now, Peter Jenner was in the 60s, from about I think it was either 1966 or very early 67 to 1968. He was the manager of Pink Floyd. Right. So this was when Pink Floyd was being led by Syd Barrett, who was their vocalist and main principal songwriter. And then Syd was either kicked out or left Pink Floyd in 1968. The debate rages on as to whether he was kicked out or walked out. But when Syd left, Peter went with him. Now, Peter Jenner was their manager from when they were he was their manager in their pre-Fame days through to when they got their record contract and had their first couple of hits and their first hit album. And so it's 1967. And then in 1968, he left with Syd Barrett. Now, apart from being Cambridge University educated, another Laurel Canyon-esque, if you like, link, if you're looking for any, with regards to Peter Jenner, was he was before he became manager, and for a little while whilst he was managing the Pink Floyd. Now, just to mention that, just as a side note here, I think it's worth mentioning that in their pre-fame days, Pink Floyd in London were basically the de facto house band of the 60s countercultural scene in London. Really? They were the darlings of the psychedelic scene in London, of the underground movement. So if there were any music events, any kind of events going on, the Pink Floyd were the main band. There were others as well, like the Soft Machine, also the Crazy World of Arthur Brown. There was the Social Deviants, which was led by a guy called Mick Farron. If you ever get to read his memoirs, they're quite interesting. But the main de facto, the psychedelic Pied Pipers, if you like, of the London scene were Pink Floyd. So they were pushing this scene, if you like. Now, if you look at Peter Jenner, for a while, whilst he was managing them, he was a lecturer at the London School of Economics, otherwise known as the LSE, a notorious location and organisation, if you like, in Britain, that they're looked on as being kind of like social engineers, if you like. Now, the London School of Economics, their roots go back to the Fabian Society, which was formed in 1884, and the Fabian Society is described as Britain's oldest political think tank, and its aim, it's said, is to bring about collectivism. A very prominent member of the Fabian Society back in the day was Bloomsbury Group member Leonard Woolf, who was the husband of Virginia Woolf. Now, the Fabian Society is credited with founding Britain's Labour Party, which is one of the main political parties in Great Britain. It's credited with founding that in 1900. In Britain at the moment, it's a two-party system when it goes to general elections. It used to be a three-party system. It used to be the Liberal Democrats, Labour, which is on the left, and the Conservatives on the right. But now it's two-party politics now. A bit like the US, it's Labour and Conservative. Now, according to the Fabian Societies, now don't forget, okay, just to let you guys, just to let you know that the Fabian Society, just in case you don't know, is an unelected organisation. Okay, now this is what it states on its website, or at least what it did state on its website a few years back when I looked. It states, or stated, that the Fabian Society is, and I quote, an influence on political and public thinking. It has a big impact on political and policy debate. Its staff work with a wide network of leading politicians and policy experts to develop and promote new ideas and to influence the climate of political opinion. So, yeah, this is an unelected organisation that has its hand basically in what goes on in policy with regards to how Great Britain is going to operate. Now, the method by which it goes towards inflicting, if you like, if I can use that word, some might like me to use that word, the method by which it goes, or if you don't like me using that word, I'll rephrase it, the method by which it goes about bringing together this quote-unquote influence, so its critics say, can be seen in the symbology through one of its logos. So if you look at its main logo, the Fabian Society's logo is that of a wolf in sheep's clothing. So in other words, its critics would say it's depicting deception. Another emblem that it's adapted over the years is that of a tortoise, and with the motto, "When I strike hard." So if you're looking at that, you might think, okay, it's a tortoise. A creature that moves slowly, steadily. So basically the Fabian Society's modus operandi is it's going to bring you change. It's going to bring about change, but in such a slow, steady manner that nobody's going to notice that society has changed. So if it wants to change society in Britain, it's going to do it so slowly that you won't even notice it's happening until the Fabian Society has reached whatever goal it is it wants to reach. Then you'll notice it once it's reached it. But how it got there, you're going to be quite kind of mystified. Now, as I say, the Fabian Society was the founder of the LSE, the London School of Economics. It was founded by after a Fabian left behind a bequest of £200,000 for it to be formed. And this was in 1897. And according to the Fabian Society's official website, the London School of Economics was formed for, and I quote, for propaganda and other purposes, and in order to provide proof positive of the collectivist ideal. Now, there's a stained glass window. I don't know if it's still on display, but it was certainly on display a few years back. And it was, I think it was on display either at the LSE or at the Fabian Society. And basically, it's a commemorative stained glass window. And this pretty much typifies what this organisation is about. And this is a stained glass window about the LSE. It's in tribute to the LSE. If you look at the stained glass window, you've got George Bernard Shaw. Right, you've got the globe, okay, the globe of the world, and on one side of the globe of the world, you've got George Bernard Shaw, who was a playwright and reported eugenicist, which is another theme that you see running across this video that I've put up about the Bloomsbury Group. So on one side of the globe of the world, you've got George Bernard Shaw, and on the other side, you've got Sidney Webb. Both these guys are Fabians, okay? And both of them, so they're standing on either side of a globe of the world, and in their hands, they have hammers. Basically, what they're doing is they're hammering the world into their shape. That's what the London School, its critics would say, that's what the London School of Economics is all about. It's also been nicknamed Rockefeller's baby because it's been funded. It was funded in the late 1920s into the early 30s. It got funding from the Rockefeller Foundation.
Yeah,
and the relation.
A lot of the U.S. Feminism was founded by the Rockefeller Foundation.
Yeah, and also modern art as well. And
right.
And I think that relationship with the Rockefeller Foundation and the LSE continues to this day. Another famous LSE student was Mick Jagger. And Bertrand Russell was a lecturer at the London School of Economics. But yeah, so Peter Jenner, I think Bertrand Russell was one of the founding kind of guiding lights of the London School of Economics. But yeah, so Peter Jenner was a lecturer at the London School of Economics, and there was an interview a few years back which I saw of him, and I'm paraphrasing this, I'm going by memory, so do forgive me, and this is very Laurel Canyon-esque. Basically, what he says in this interview is he says, yeah, I was a lecturer at the London School of Economics, and, you know, I fancied becoming a music manager. But I needed a band. So basically what I did was I was walking around one day and I went into a club and I saw this band playing, and I thought, hey, and it was the Pink Floyd. And he said, oh, wow, now they look like the kind of guys that I can manage. So I started managing them and I left my job. I mean, as you do. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. It's got that kind of Laurel Canyon-esque thing to it. Another address in Bloomsbury that's worth taking a look at, somewhere in the video that I don't actually physically go to, but I do mention, is on Southampton Row in Bloomsbury, and this is just across the road, if I'm not mistaken, from the British Museum. And this is about, if you take a brisk walk, I'd say it was about 5 or 10 minutes worth walking from where Bertrand Russell's flat was that I mentioned in the last episode. So if you walk from his flat and you walk to this other destination, it's on Southampton Row, I think it is. That's the location of the Indica bookshop.
Wow. That's where Yoko met John. And that was owned by the Process Church.
Yeah, I'm really intrigued by this Process Church link, because I've heard it from you and I haven't heard it from anyone else, and I'd really like to find out more about this, because I haven't been able to find the links myself between the Process Church and the Indica bookshop. Now, one of the owners it was a three-way ownership. One of the owners was Barry Miles. The other one was John Dunbar, who was married to Marianne Faithfull, in the 1960s. He married her in 1965. He divorced her in 1970, I think it was. They had a child together, but they weren't together for most of that time, because Marianne Faithfull in 1966 went into a serious relationship with Mick Jagger, former LSE student, and that was one of the romance stories of the 60s, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think she's like on Facebook, Marianne Faithfull still.
Yeah, she probably is. I mean, she's...
she might be the one that just passed away, because I know a couple of those, I guess they call them groupies. They used to call them back in those days.
No, she's still with us. It's Anita Pallenberg that's passed away.
Gotcha. Marianne Faithfull, I've tried to get her on the show. Yeah, she's not on. She has some project. That's one of these things, okay, with these people who know stuff. And they put out little clues here and there, and then you talk to them and says, hey, man, come on the show, talk about this. Oh, I got this big project in the works. And I can't talk about it because I'm under contract. Man, they go in there and they snap these people up, and they put them under contract with NDAs. Oh, there's going to be a big film. There's going to be a big book. It never comes out. And then they die.
Yeah.
You know?
She's still with us.
Yeah.
So the other owner of that three-way partnership was Peter Asher, who was the brother, or who is the brother of Jane Asher, who again was part of another of those 60s great famous 60s music romances. She was and is a famous English actress, and she was going out with Paul McCartney.
Alice in Wonderland she was in.
She was indeed. She was in a BBC adaptation of Alice in Wonderland, and I do mention that in my video because it does have some very interesting connections to MK Ultra and Dr. William Sargent and her father. I won't go into that here. I would just say go and watch the video, because that will just take us off into a completely different thing, another road. But so you got the Ashers involved. So she was going out with Paul McCartney from 1960.
You there?
1968.
Yeah. And
so, Peter Asher, her brother, was a partner in this. Now, the Indica was an art gallery and a bookshop, and basically this was the shop and the art gallery. It started off in Mason's Yard, an address called Mason's Yard in another part of London. Okay, so the address that I mentioned in Bloomsbury that it was at, the Indica, that's not where they started. They started at a different address a year or so before. And it was an art gallery and bookshop when it initially began together in the same building. And John Dunbar ran the art gallery, and Barry Miles and Peter ran the bookshop. But it wasn't just a bookshop. It was basically it was the go-to place for the underground scene. And it was very
quick, I can't stop myself. I got to say, Peter Asher was the manager for James Taylor at the time when James Taylor ran into Mark David Chapman.
Right. James Taylor was on Apple Records. He was on the Beatles record label, but they didn't know how to handle him. They had a talent there, and for some reason they just couldn't get him together to make hits for him or to give him the support he needed. So he left, and Peter Asher went with him, I think, and produced him and managed him, I think, and I think that's how it worked out. Yeah. So the Indica was this go-to shop where everybody. It was because the avant-garde. They supported the avant-garde, and as I think I've said in a previous chat with you, Ed, the avant-garde, I would suggest, is the foundation stone of the 60s underground movement in London. I don't know about the US, but certainly in London, whether it's in poetry, music, art, theatre, music, you name it.
What about with this whole Brumsley group here, Bloomsbury, Salvador Dali?
I got nothing about Salvador
other
Dali.
Other surrealists, famous surrealists at the time?
No, no, not really. I mean, you could fit with regards to the avant-garde. I mean, surrealism kind of fits into that kind of bag, doesn't it? To use a 60s word there, bag. So that was the go-to place because it sold avant-garde books. It also sold books on the occult, Crowley and Kenneth Anger and all the rest and all of that. Also avant-garde music. It sold records and so that was the bookshop part. And then you also had the art gallery run by John Dunbar. Anyway, after a while they split and the Indica gallery stayed where it was, and the Indica bookshop went to this address in Bloomsbury. Now, downstairs in the basement, that's where John Hoppy Hopkins started IT magazine. If you remember, I mentioned in the last episode, there was this underground newspaper that began in London, in countercultural London. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was the first underground newspaper in Europe, although I might be wrong about that. But that started in Bloomsbury, downstairs in the basement. And that was thanks to John Hoppy Hopkins in the main, although Barry Miles was also an editor of it, and he was part of it too. Now, another link here to Bloomsbury, if we look at Bertrand Russell, again, it just keeps going back to Bertrand Russell. Now, Bertrand Russell, if you remember, I mentioned that he lived in this flat in Bloomsbury for a while. Now, it said that he was I'm not entirely sure on this, but I'm led to understand from what I've read that Bertrand Russell for a time was teaching at Harvard, and this would have been in the 1910s at some point, and it said that one of his students was T.S. Eliot.
Wow.
And when T.S. Eliot came to the UK, and it said that he became friends with the Bloomsbury group. And that was thanks to Bertrand Russell, who introduced him to Roger Fry, to Virginia Woolf and her Fabian husband Leonard, and also introduced him to Aldous Huxley as well, another supporter of eugenics, of course. And whilst he was in London when he first came over, I think it was, he actually Bertrand Russell actually sublet his apartment to T.S. Eliot. Now, the interesting link here, I think it's interesting anyway, is that if we look to the Asher family, Margaret Asher, Jane and Peter's mother, her maiden name is Margaret Elliot. Now, according to an officially sanctioned biography, which came out, I think, in 1997, it's called Many Years From Now. It's about Paul McCartney. It's an officially sanctioned biography which was written by his friend, former Indica owner Barry Miles. According to that book, it goes into a little bit of detail about the bloodline, about the T.S. Eliot link to the Asher family, and I'll just quote it here. This is according to Barry Miles's book on Paul McCartney, and I quote, "The Honourable Edward Granville Eliot, brother of the 7th and 8th Earls of St. Germans of Port Eliot, St. Germans in Cornwall, is an ancient Cornish lineage with the red hair of the fighting Celt." Yes, Jane Asher herself has stated in an interview, at least one interview I've read, that yes, indeed, the Asher family are connected to T.S. Eliot. So there's another link there.
Jane and Peter Asher, are they alive now?
Yes, they are. Yeah,
that's
definitely.
fascinating. And there's a whole fascinating thing too, the whole thing, the replacement of Paul around that stuff too, and it was so coincidental around the breakup of Paul and Jane Asher too.
Yeah.
Around that time, it was the same period of time.
Yeah. Yeah, there was a lot of strange things going on. You had Brian Epstein's quote unquote suicide. Then you had his lawyer David Jacobs. He quote unquote committed suicide a year later. Then there was Richard Asher, Jane and Peter's father, Dr. Richard Asher, who committed suicide. I think it was in 1969. Wow. He was found dead in his basement. He'd gone missing for 7 days, and they found him in his house in the basement. Now, this was a family house. Most of the family, if not all of the Asher family, lived in that house. So, why did it take them 7 days to find him in the basement? Dead. If your father or your husband has gone missing for 7 days, wouldn't you give the house a good look, to see if he's there or not? Because this is a large house. If you've seen photographs of it, it's a big house. So you might think to yourself, if you live in a big house,
maybe he fell. Maybe he fell.
Yeah, or maybe he's downstairs.
Or suicide. He could be hanging from a pole downstairs.
Yeah, or wouldn't you think, we haven't seen him in a while. Do you think he's downstairs? Hey, Jane, can you just go downstairs and see if your father's down there?
Yeah.
So, 7 days. With regards to John Dunbar, a fellow Indica partner. Again, in the Bloomsbury video, I go to another address which links into John Dunbar, and this is an address. It's actually now it's the University of London. Okay, that's what it is now. But during the war, it was the Ministry of Information. It was actually the propaganda building for the British government during the Second World War. This is deep in the heart of Bloomsbury. And if you look at the building, and I do go to the building in the video, as I say, and I do stand there for a while and take a shot of it. If you look at it, it's like a pyramid. It's built like a pyramid, but without the capstone. Now, with regards to John Dunbar, his father was a British film producer. His name was Robert Bob Dunbar. Now, during World War II, Bob Dunbar worked for, here we go, another Laurel Canyon-esque type thing. During the Second World War, he worked for the British government's Foreign Office as a deputy head of the Inter-Allied Information Office in Mexico and the Caribbean. And he was also head of press, public and cultural relations at the British Embassy in Moscow. And in fact, if I'm not mistaken, I think John Dunbar actually grew up in Moscow. He was a baby. He was a toddler whilst his father was still working in Moscow. So he grew up there. Now, basically, yeah, as I say, basically his father, Bob Dunbar, Robert, was dealing in government propaganda. And before taking on those posts that I've just mentioned, and this is during the Second World War, he'd worked at the British government's Department for Propaganda, the Ministry of Information, this building in Bloomsbury. And yeah, this was set up especially during the war to deal with British government propaganda. And it's actually mentioned, this building has actually served as an inspiration for George Orwell's 1984. Because his wife used to work at the Ministry of Information during the war.
So much of it's just right in your face, you know?
I know, it's right in your face. So he inspired by this, and maybe, I don't know, but maybe he saw the building with its pyramid without the capstone thing. But for whatever reason, he based the fictional Ministry of Truth, or Mini-True, in his book on this building. This is where John Dunbar's father worked for a time in during the war and a little bit after the war, actually.
Matt Sergiou, now this is how long the video, the Bloomsbury Group video on your Conspiro TV YouTube channel is 3 hours long. But how long were you working on this? Months? How long were you working on this?
Well, I went to London in January, as I said in the first.
Right.
I went to London in January and I noticed all this stuff.
2023 you started on this.
Yeah.
Less than a year.
Less than a year, yeah.
And by coincidence, because you were going there anyway and you stumbled on this little neighborhood.
Yeah, it was in the back of my mind. I was always aware of Bloomsbury and this reputation for them being rebels of their generation, and being these quote unquote free thinkers and the sexual permissiveness. I was aware of this, and it was always in the back of my mind that because I'm, ingrained in this, so wrapped up in all this 60s counterculture research of London, I always had it at the back of my mind that, maybe I should look at the Bloomsbury Group whenever I get the time, because it could be like a route, an inspiration for what happened in the 60s. But that's as much as I thought about it. It was just in the back of my mind. But then when I stumbled upon, quite literally, Bloomsbury, when I booked this hotel in London and went there and thought, wait a minute, I'm in Bloomsbury. Well, seeing as it's only then that I thought maybe I should do something about this, because I'm here, here I am in Bloomsbury. So I went for a walk around, took some notes of some addresses and locations and landmarks. Then I went back home and I thought, well, I'll go back at some point and make a video about it. Just shoot the video on my phone of these places, these locations. So that's what I did. And then I came back home again and started to do the research. And a lot of the research I already was aware of and I'd already looked into, like John Dunbar, like the Indica, and John Hoppy Hopkins. A lot of this stuff I've already researched already. So basically what I was doing, I was looking at the Bloomsbury stuff that I wasn't aware of, and I was taking all the other stuff that I already was aware of and slotted it in, sort of tailored it into the narrative, if you like. Not in a contrived way, not in a way as if to force a narrative, but it fell in naturally.
Oh, my goodness.
That's the thing. It's just amazing.
Yeah. No funding, pretty much all on your own, and then there's so much disinformation out there, and we're trying to confirm things. Hey, was the guy processed? Was he not? Sometimes you hear they are, sometimes you hear that. So much disinformation out there. To this day, guys, there's all kinds of infiltration galore on this topic here, man. I can think back, as I talk to you, I think, boy, a couple of years ago, I could pick up the phone and talk to Hank Harrison. Hey, did you know this? Do you know that? And half the time he would tell you, oh, yeah. But the other half of the time it was like, oh, Ed. You couldn't count on this guy 100%, man. Sometimes he knew some stuff, and other times he just wasn't. Half the time he was making it up too. But there's really nowhere to go, man. And we're all on a shoestring here, and then we got these guys out there infiltrating this info. We only got about 10 minutes, man. What do you want to sum up here in the next 10 minutes?
Okay, shall I bring it to what I would suggest is please go and watch the video and you'll see the whole thing. I'm just picking out the bits that, anyway, I'm just picking out bits. But I really should, do you think I should round it up with Bertrand Russell and Tavistock? Because Tavistock, the clinic, Clinic is in Bloomsbury. It was in Bloomsbury. The Tavistock Clinic was born in Bloomsbury, and it has links to Bertrand Russell and his family.
Gotcha. So so since we're almost to 9 minutes, why don't we do this? Why don't you give us a brief overview of that, and we'll come back and we'll do an hour on Tavistock.
Okay, so basically what happened was...
Move in with me.
Okay, so basically, I'll bring this to a wrap up here with the big clincher. Okay, so Tavistock, the Tavistock Institute is what we know about the Tavistock Institute, but it was born from the Tavistock Clinic in England, in London. It began in 1920, and I won't. You don't want me to go into the history of the thing, do you? Really? Basically, I'll go into a quick thing. Basically, the Tavistock Clinic came into being thanks to a guy largely by the name of Hugh Crichton Miller, who was a physician and psychiatrist. And during the First World War, he saw what was then a new kind of condition that was being noticed, which was then called shell shock, or what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder. And he wanted to treat these soldiers who were suffering from this new sort of... it was at the time it was regarded as a new discovery, this condition. So what he did was, after the First World War, he wanted to make a clinic where he could treat not only soldiers from the First World War, but he wanted to take what he'd learned from the First World War and treat civilians as well. So what he did was he started up the Tavistock Clinic with, and this opened at number 51 Tavistock Square in Bloomsbury. Now, if we look at Bertrand Russell, Bertrand Russell is directly related to the Russell bloodline of the Duke of Bedford. Okay, now the Duke of Bedford family name got ownership of Bloomsbury. Okay, it actually got to own the estate of Bloomsbury in London back in 1669, when William Lord Russell, son and heir to the 5th Earl of Bedford, married the daughter of the 4th Earl of Southampton, Lady Rachel Vaughan. Now, the Russells' roots, can be traced back to an English town in the county of Devon. Now, what happened was, back in the 16th century, there was what was called the dissolution. This was when King Henry VIII transferred ownership of properties and riches that were once in the hands of the Catholic monasteries. He handed them over to new owners, and one of those to benefit from this was one of his royal courtiers by the name of John Russell, who became the 1st Earl of Bedford. And he took ownership of most of that town that I mentioned in the county of Devon. The name of that town in Devon is Tavistock.
Wow.
Right. So fast forward to 1920, we've got the Tavistock Clinic, which opened at number 51 Tavistock Square, Bloomsbury, and the building, the property, was actually donated to the Tavistock Clinic to Hugh Crichton Miller by the 11th Duke of Bedford. So basically, Bertrand Russell, the man who was the father of CND, the man who is regarded as the forefather of what was to become the 60s counterculture of Britain, of London, was, through his bloodline, the supporters and the financiers, and helped to give rise and give birth to the Tavistock Clinic, which then later became and grew out into the Tavistock Institute. And yeah, as I mentioned in the last episode, at number 52, Tavistock Square is where, for a time, Leonard Woolf, Fabian Leonard Woolf and his wife Virginia Woolf lived for a time. Tavistock Clinic at number 51 began in 1920, but by the end of the 20s it moved because it got too big for purpose. The Woolfs lived at number 52 between 1924 and 1939. So they would have been there when the Tavistock Clinic was there. It no longer exists. It was bombed during the war, during the Blitz, and a hotel, a hotel now stands there. And I do show this in the video. I think the hotel is called the Tavistock Hotel. And it's actually the location of the 7/7 bombings. You remember that back in the day?
Yes, I do. We did a show about that a long time ago, yeah.
Yeah, there was the bus that blew up. If you look online, you type in 7/7 bombings London.
Mail bombing, right?
It was, I think, and I'm so embarrassed that I can't remember, so ashamed, but it was a while back. I think it might have been 2007, but again, please don't quote me on that. But yeah, if you look online, if you type in 7/7 bombing London, you'll see footage of a bus with its roof blown off. That is on Tavistock Square. That bus blew up on Tavistock Square. There was also incidents on London Underground, I think.
Yeah.
So if you think about
all very suspicious stuff, by the way, too. We did a whole show about this. Yeah. I'll repeat the show. Yeah.
Yeah. And there was another author that wrote a really good book about it. Nick Colostrom. That's it. His name is Nick.
That's the guy I had on. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the guy. Yeah. So. Yeah, so and if you think about it, it's just dawned on me. So you've got the Tavistock Square, a bomb going off in Tavistock Square, and a terrorist attack on the London Underground.
Yeah.
But yeah. So shall I?
Stuff. Yeah, go ahead. Keep going. 4 minutes.
You want me to keep going? All right. I'll get. How long have I got?
4 minutes.
4 minutes. Okay. I will just give you a little bit of a background on the Tavistock Institute. Now, because I think it might be important. So here we have the Tavistock Clinic, okay? So we're told, according to official history, that the Tavistock Clinic came into being in order to... It all sounds very benevolent. Hugh Crichton Miller gets this clinic together to help people with mental health issues who have gone through mental anguish during the war, and he's inspired by that, he wants to help. But from that, we go into what is... this institute, and I've got a quote here from the Tavistock Institute's one of their websites, because they've got loads of websites. It's quite a labyrinth if you go looking on their websites. They've probably done that deliberately to confuse you, but they put up a statement to mark the centenary of the opening of the Tavistock Clinic, and here's a quote, and this typifies what the Tavistock Institute is. In our earliest history, just over a centenary ago, a group of medical professionals who called themselves the Tavistock Group worked with the British Army to help soldiers who had been prisoners during World War I return to civilian life, and equally as importantly, to help their families and communities adjust to having them back. Now here we go. From returning soldiers to rapid changes in business management, workplace demographics, and the adoption or rejection of new technologies throughout the 20th century, to the global social challenges of the 21st century, we pour ourselves into organizations needing change, individuals needing change, systems needing change, and sometimes the change needed is to accept change isn't needed. What arises from the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations isn't abstract. It's applicable study making a difference in all of our lives. And I've got another quote here, again from the Tavistock Institute, one from one of their websites. in amongst that labyrinth. And this is from the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. Rowan Williams. So this was like a very important religious leader in England. And I quote, "The impact of the Tavistock on our social assumptions, its impacts on education, business, the understanding of the family, the life of the arts, and of course therapy, as a sideline, demonstrates beyond any doubt that it has genuinely been a culturally defining presence." So basically, if you could read into that the Tavistock Institute, from having started off as this so-called benevolent place where you could go to sort out your mental health issues, has its tentacles in every aspect of British society and culture. Mind-blowing, I think. You might think,
Yeah, you want to know what, too, man? We tried to do a couple of shows on Tavistock, and it always seems to be some kind of bait and switch. I got a guy on here, and I still don't know. And that word soup you just gave me, man, I still don't know what they're really up to over there, or even what the allegations are of what they're up to over there. Maybe we can have you come back and give us a good lesson on Tavistock. But you can check out our good friend here, Matt Sergiou, conspiromedia.wordpress.com, occultbeatles.wordpress.com. On Facebook is Conspiro Media. That has the links to everything, especially Conspiro TV, which is his YouTube channel, which has a lot of great stuff on there. I barely got a chance to watch the first half hour of the Bloomsbury Group video on there too, but I encourage everybody to go check that out and do a little watch that. I guess after you listen to the show. They can listen to the show first, then go watch it. I would suggest. But we are out of time, my friend. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me on, and I hope I've been of some use.
Matt, no kidding around. It's rare I ask a guy to come back the next day. Okay, you're like a handful of guys I've had come back the next day. So I tell you that.
Oh, wow.
I thank you, man. This is really, really good information. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good night,
Thank
sir.
you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.